So this is Phoenix Incandescent. I'm going to do the prologue today. Chapter 1 has been out on YouTube for 3 or 4 years or something. I don't know. But this summer I would love to put the entire first book of my Endeavor series up so you can kind of use it as a bit of an audiobook. I don't know how much I rambled in the first one. I don't think I did too much. But anyway, so let's get started before I ramble. Audrey Locklear turned her face to stare blankly out the small airplane window. The black sky was blanketed with stars. The plane flew miles above. It had been many years. Yet she felt her past calling, coiling through the miles and years of darkness. She felt the thump of her heart increase in frequency and strength, and she took in a sharp breath of air. Isaac reached for her hand and squeezed. He blinked and straightened in his chair. The bond between them, forged through the years, was strong enough to alert him through the layers of sleep. He rubbed his eyes and stretched his arm over her shoulders to pull her close. She turned her face to him and smiled. "You are mine." He rubbed the bridge of his nose and adjusted his glasses. "Darling." She leaned closer and kissed the stubble on his chin. "Ah, you missed," he chuckled. She sat back a bit and smiled coyly. He blinked and looked at her with wakeful eyes. Her emerald green eyes were bright and white. Her dress was wrinkled and her legs were crossed. One leg kicked up and down in the air in the small space before her. Her black hair was a mess of wayward strands, and her lips were drawn tight across her face. She had been worrying again. Isaac chuckled softly and leaned closer to her face. He reached across with his other arm to pull her closer. He traced a finger across her lips. "I won't, miss," he warned her. She blushed, and he wished that they weren't on an airplane. They could have traveled home by portal, but he wouldn't risk losing her. He kissed her once, quickly, then once again, slowly. She laid her face against his, and he felt few warm tears fall on his skin and slide down his neck to the stiff collar of his shirt. "Oh, Isaac," she whispered. Her hand fell to his waistcoat, and she traced the top edges of it. "I never thought we'd have her. Then I thought she'd never survive. And now we have told her she has a choice. And now we have to tell her she has a choice. But does she?" Isaac cleared his throat and kissed Audrey's teary face. "Of course she has a choice, my darling." "You are getting weaker." She shook the top of his waistcoat. Isaac raised his eyebrows. "You let me worry about that." "You are mine," she reminded him, matching his stern look with one of her own. "And so I am." He kissed her forehead and sighed. They sat perched on their seats, thin and tall forms leaning against each other, hands entwined. Isaac let one of her hands go briefly as he reached across and pulled the shade over the window. "There," he whispered to his wife, but they both knew she could still feel it, for the bond whispered between them. Isaac rubbed her arm absently and tucked her head against his neck. She kissed his neck before settling against him, her breath warm against his skin, but she wasn't crying any more. Isaac rested his face on hers. What were they to do? They had postponed the decision for the last minute, intent on enjoying their daughter for as long as possible. Pangs of guilt seized him. They should have told her years ago. They should have told her many things. But their daughter wasn't anything like he or Audrey. She was fiercely whatever she felt at the moment. He had hoped she would calm some by now, but the truth was that even by human standards, she was still young and passionate. He lifted his head back up and stared into Audrey's intent gaze. "We will tell her," he promised. "Tomorrow, after the ball." "Today," Audrey countered. "We will tell her today." Isaac lifted one eyebrow and settled his lips into a firm line. "Let her have tonight, Dee." She quarreled with him silently with her eyes for a moment. He wiggled his eyebrows and cracked a smile at her. She laughed a little too loudly, more than when passengers shushed them. "You're right. The news would run tonight." She finally gave in with a shake of her head. "We have waited this long," he said, and ran his fingers through her hair, stopping to gently tug a tangle free. He ran his fingers through her hair until the tangles were no more, and she looked relaxed. He buried his nose in her hair for a long second and inhaled lavender and chamomile. "Do you think?" she wondered aloud, disturbing his trance. Isaac straightened back up. "Perhaps. But he's not much younger than I," he answered. He looked across the cabin of sleeping humans. The best option would be to find her a young weaver to wed, who he could trust with the secret. He shook his head. "But that's a heavy weight to take on, and we can't go around telling every suitor." It affects her as well, she chided him, and she has no choice but to deal with it. He smiled apologetically. It does. He rubbed his forehead. Tomorrow is going to be hard. Well, don't look at me, Audrey huffed. They were shushed again, louder this time. She leaned close to him. I don't know where she got it from. Isaac smiled sadly. I do. Audrey blinked. Your sister? Mm-hmm. He said, I'm afraid so. He curled his hand around hers. Maybe Ebby can get through to her. Audrey shook her head fiercely at him. Waves of black cascaded around her shoulders. We can't rely on Ebby like that anymore, Isaac. She scolded him. And this is too large for even Ebby to iron out. We all will have to ride this wave bravely. Yes, darling, he said with a twitch of his lips. Flirt, she scolded him playfully now. She reached into his jacket and snapped his suspender gently. Temptress, he pulled her hand out and kissed her knuckles before placing her hand in her lap. Audrey teased her lips into a playful pout. Isaac chuckled and flicked the armrest between them. Darn our persistent chaperone. Audrey's shoulders shook. She covered her mouth with her hand and her eyes sparkled. Isaac laid his hand on the armrest, palm up. May I hold your hand, madame? You may, sir. They sat silently for a few moments in the stillness of the morning hours, hands entwined fiercely. I remember when I first saw you, he finally said with a devilish grin. She traced his collarbone through his shirt with her fingers. I remember when you first saw me. Isaac blushed now. The airplane was not traveling fast enough for him. His fingers fumbled with hers, and he knew that she felt the same way he did. I suppose we must be patient, he said as he looked up at the ceiling in frustration. There were spells he could use, of course. He could freeze the others in the cabin, but he didn't want to risk being found out by somebody from another part of the plane. He could suspend the airplane and freeze everybody, but that seemed a trifle selfish. They could hide away in the restroom and put up a protection spell, but then there was a matter of hygiene. They were both a bit stuck up in that department. He looked over at Audrey, and they both blushed. Isaac chuckled and winked at her. She smiled coyly at him once more and batted her eyelashes. They would settle for the old flirtation routine for the remainder of the trip. Isaac shifted in his seat. He would take her directly to bed as soon as they were home, morning or not. Audrey reached over and teased her fingers through Isaac's thick black hair. He was tan and fit, the result of love for adventuring and hiking through the wilderness as often as he could. She ran her hand down the side of his face and across his chest. His clothes were ironed straight into obedience despite their traveling. She laid her head back on his shoulder and breathed him in, ink and parchment and fresh air and tea and mint. He kissed her forehead and closed his hazel eyes. His fingers were still curled around hers. She squeezed them and he returned the affection. Soon they would be home. Soon life would change. But in this moment, time ticked a little slower, a little more kindly. Well, that is it for now. And like I said, the first one's already ready if you want to go to that one. And I will have, I might be able to squeeze in the second chapter this afternoon, but I think I'm kind of pushing it. So I'm going to try to get about 1 or 2 up a day until they're all here. So if this is your first time hearing this story, I hope you enjoyed it. I really, really love this series. It's been a ton of fun. And if you like Phoenix well enough, the first, or one of the first chapters, I kind of skip, but the first chapter of the 5 books that are ready are up on YouTube, and there are 5 books. I hope to eventually have 12, so this is a very large series. If you love magic, and you love big character casts, and fantasy of all kinds, I do tend to be a little more girl-led, and I'm not going to apologize for that because it needs to be done. But really, I've had a lot of people enjoy it, so if you do too, then read on. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.